Hi, it's Anne from Unity Physiotherapy and Wellbeing. I wanted to share a few thoughts and reflections following a discussion with somebody I was working with today. It's about the mind body, and they mentioned that they think it's really important and helpful that we now understand much more about the mind body interlinks, which was in relation to a specific point in time for them. And it absolutely is really important. And as part of our discussion, I mentioned that on one hand, we have the mind body interlinked, and on the other, we don't. And the reason we don't is because for things to be interlinked, they need to be separate. They need to be divisible. The mind and body are not separate, they are not fully divisible. The mind and body are part of our whole body, our whole experience. Our head is not separate to our body, our head is part of our body, and we experience the world through our whole being, our whole body, unless we are disconnected from some of it. And actually, that is really common. So we looked at actually how these things could be seen as not separate, and that's how I see them, and that completely resonated with them too. And there's a number of reasons why we see them as separate. One is that that's how they've been studied in health and well-being for many, many years. We study the mind, we study the body, and to an extent that's helpful and important, and it's also not how we experience the world. And it's important we look at that whole experience, and there are studies that do it. We split things into psychology, biology, sociology, etc. And again, helpful to an extent. And also we need to remember that these are part of a whole, and that, for example, our psychology is part of our biology, so our thoughts have chemical messengers associated with them, which is how our body communicates. We looked at kind of language that has contributed to seeing the mind and body as separate. We looked at how our conditioning and society encourages to see the mind and body as separate rather than mind, body, body, mind, which is how I often write it, without that and, without that space, because that suggests division. So we looked at that and how society encourages us to live in our heads, encourages us to live in a cognitive way. There are narratives around mind over matter and mindset, which I actually think are quite toxic. Now, don't get me wrong, mindset is really important, how we see things, reframing some of our thoughts and beliefs and different things are important, but there's a lot of toxic positivity, and the way that we're often encouraged to use kind of mindset and mind over matter is to ignore and avoid certain feelings and thoughts and to push down feelings for the purpose of often things like achieving, striving, overdoing, being successful, maybe proving something. So that is really unhelpful, and it has many consequences. One of the consequences is that actually people who live with persistent pain, ME/CFS, long COVID, other health conditions, actually feel that as a result of that, or partly as a result of that, that they are weak. They are not good enough because they couldn't use their mindset to push through, to get rid of symptoms, and that's because it doesn't work like that. Mindset is yes important, and no, it's not causative. So that's one of the things that it contributes to, but there are many consequences of that sort of way of being, thinking. And the other thing that we touched on that I think is important to mention is that there is so much disconnection now. We are often disconnected from ourselves, from others, from nature. And when you look at trauma, which is big T and little t trauma, and there's a lot of trauma in the world, is that trauma can be seen as a wound of disconnection, which is something Gabor Mate talks about, which really resonated with me, because trauma disconnects us from ourselves, from compassion, from others, from the world, from possibilities, from nature, from safety. there's many ways in which trauma disconnects us, and there are many ways in which we are disconnected. So we touched on the importance of needing to reconnect, and the way that we reconnect matters. We need to be able to connect in a way that is compassionate, that has a loving presence. We need to be able to connect and be with the whole of our experience in a compassionate, non-judgmental, curious, loving way. And that takes a lot of practice, and actually ongoing practice, which I'll touch on in a minute. So being present in our whole body, our whole being, means that we can be present with whatever's present. We can start to build capacity to be with what's tricky and challenging, and we can choose how we are present, how we're embodied. So the more we practice being present in a compassionate, loving, curious way, the more we can be present in that way for ourselves and others. We also need to remember that we're part of nature, and research shows as well that when we remember the connectedness with nature, or when we feel the connectedness with nature, or in other words, when we remember we're part of nature, we are more likely to act in ways that is supportive of the health of nature and the conservation of nature. And when we are able to connect to our true self and our compassionate self, we are more likely to help alleviate suffering in ourselves and others. So those things are really important. And I said that we need to keep doing the practices, and that is because if we don't, then we lose capacity. This is something that came up in a compassion meeting with other therapists recently, is that we do need to keep doing the practices. As Dr. Rick Hansen says, I think it was him, not unless I'm misremembering, when the rubber hits the road, we need to have that capacity. So he essentially says, we need these things when the rubber hits the road. If we don't keep practicing, we lose some capacity. So say we are going through a challenging time, or we're processing some trauma, maybe we're doing somatic and embodiment practices, some inner work, maybe we're having therapy, we build that capacity inside to be with more of what's present. And then things get a bit easier, and we stop doing the practices. And then when we need them again, we have a bit less capacity again. And actually they're really helpful on a daily basis, even when life is a bit easier. So I think I really wanted to share that mind and body are not separate. It's body, mind, body, whole human being, whole experience, that we need to be able to be present with the whole of our experience in an embodied way. So we're present in our body, not only living in our thoughts and cognitive way of being, that we choose how we're present through practice, that we remember we're part of nature, and that we need to reconnect to heal ourselves, to heal nature, and to create a more compassionate and trauma-informed society and world. So I'd love to know your thoughts. I have waffled away a bit, but those things have been in my head and my reflections, not only in my head actually. So there you go, that's some of the language, because it's stuff that I've been feeling and thinking about and noticing the thoughts in my body. So that was that kind of embodied way of processing. So you see how that language, that we naturally use comes and kind of changes the meaning of things. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think. Do let me know, and take care.